Hello, my name is Jim Ellringer. I'm on the Faculty of Biology at the University of Utah. And I'd like to make a brief presentation on the history of Utah vegetation in the area surrounding Salt Lake City. I'll try to reconstruct what we know about the history when the Mormon pioneers arrived in the 1840s and the transitions that took place over the last 100+ years up through what we see today. This is meant to be a general talk and to provide information about the entire spectrum of changes that have taken place. My wife and I are relatively newcomers to the state of Utah. We arrived on the evening of July 24th, 1977. We arrived about 10 p.m. after having had dinner in Wendover, and we're so impressed on the way that Utahns greeted us. We arrived into the valley at 10 o'clock, and lo and behold, there were fireworks everywhere. It was only afterward that we realized that it was Pie and Beer Day. I had first visited Utah in 1972 with my brother, who's a geologist. We were passing through, and this picture here was taken of my brother back in 1972. And just to show you that changes do take place, here we are passing in front of the very same sign in 2018. The sign had changed, but none of the vegetation had changed. What I'd like to do is to present 6 stories on the changes that have taken place. First, let's start off with what did the pioneers see when they entered the valley? They didn't see what you see in this picture here today. Instead, there are various reconstructions, mostly lithographic or line drawings. And here you see of 2 individuals looking over the Salt Lake Valley. Presumably, this is Emigration Canyon. And no, those are not oil refineries off in the distance. Perhaps they might have been trees, but there's very few descriptions that suggest that trees were present. What we know largely comes from people that were in the valley at the time or explored the valley earlier than before the Mormon pioneer settlers arrived, or from the earliest from Father Escalante. Now, it's not clear that Father Escalante actually made it into the Salt Lake Valley. We know from the descriptions that he made it to Utah Valley, but he might have headed up the canyon and not moved forward to the Salt Lake Valley. But we have reports from Jim Bridger, a trapper, from John Fremont, who was a Union soldier explorer in 1843, and then a federal surveyor, Howard Stansbury, who came through after the pioneers had arrived. And they give descriptions that are more or less in agreement with each other. The valleys were covered with grasses, some evidence that they might have been recently burned, but it was unclear whether or not it was a lightning fire or was burned by the Native Americans. So Fremont followed through and said the same thing. His records indicate that there were a lot of grasses, but there was a key factor here. The grasses had all dried up by September. Edwin Breyer came through the valley, and he reported the same thing, a grassland, although there were some cottonwood trees near the mouths of the canyon. When the Mormon pioneers arrived, they also found that there were grasses, but no trees and no shrubs in the valley. A great variety of green grass and very luxuriant grass covered the valley bottoms for miles. That's the report. 2 years later, when Howard Stansbury came through, he said that there were perennial pastures in the Salt Lake Valley and even extensive grasslands over next door in Tooele Valley. So this picture here is largely correct, suggesting that it was a grassland when the pioneers arrived. Probably a grassland dominated by crested wheatgrass shown here, which is a perennial wheatgrass, not tolerant of excessive grazing, but tolerant of some grazing. The other likely plants in the valley, which are not well described, at least initially, would have been a number of perennial shrubs, such as sagebrush here, Artemisia tridentata. And it's likely, based on what we now know of further looking into the descriptions, is that the valley floor was largely grassland with some shrubs, and the foothills were grasslands with more shrubs and occasionally a small tree or a large tree as you got into the riparian or next to the creek areas. So this would have included things such as crested wheatgrass and bluegrass and loco weed and goldenrod, or shrubs such as sagebrush, gamble oak, snakeweed, big-tooth maple, things that we're largely familiar with today. The box elder, cottonwoods, and some willows, and maybe even some water birch were present, but were limited to the valley, the riparian areas, right at where the valley floor came and met with the canyons. And of course, these trees were much more common up the canyon. So Gilbert came through in the 1890s and began to document more what the vegetation looked like. His quote is very insightful. In the virgin condition, most lowland valleys and all upland valleys were once covered with grasses and other herbaceous vegetation. These have been eaten off by the herds of the white man, and in their place has sprung up a sparse growth of low bushes between which the ground is bare. That is, the Mormon pioneers came in, released cattle onto the landscape. The cattle ate these perennial grasses, and as the grasses decreased in abundance, shrubs came in. So there was a transition very early on after the Mormon pioneers arrived. So let's talk more about this transition, because it's important to understand what came to be and why it came to be. So here's one of the few original photographs of the valley taken in the late 1860s. And you can see here the Salt Lake City area. And over here, you can see Fort Douglas, the fort that was put in by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War to ensure that the Mormons stayed with the North. You might recall, if you know a little bit about the history of Utah, that the Mormon community had adopted slavery as a practice, but they had never practiced slavery. So Abraham Lincoln was justifiably worried about whether the Mormons would go for the North or the South, so he brought out a brigade and set up Fort Douglas, aiming their cannons downtown. Here you can see by the late 1860s that in the foreground, the area is dominated by sagebrush. So Gilbert reported this in the 1890s, but as early as 1868, most of the perennial grasses had been replaced. They'd been eaten off by cattle, and in their place had come shrubs. Today, when we look out on that very same landscape from Ensign Peak, we see a different picture. What we see is that the perennial grassland is gone. We see that the shrubland is gone, and in its place, we have an urban forest. An urban forest that didn't exist at the time the pioneers arrived in the valley. We know from a number of drawings, such as the one shown here, you can see the point of the mountain down to the south, that the city was laid out in the grid fashion that we enjoy today, and that there were scattered farms throughout the valley with the Jordan River on our right. Today, when we look out across the valley, we can see that same structure of streets, main streets that are 600 blocks apart from each other. And what you see here is now, as I mentioned before, an urban forest that didn't exist in the 1840s. We do have some recent photographs. Here's a picture from 1910, some 114 years ago, at the mouth of Mill Creek Canyon. So this is getting closer to our home and the east side of the valley. In the foreground, you can see some crested wheatgrass, you can see some loco weed, and you see lots of sagebrush. Off in the distance, you can see Utah juniper. So this is one of the pioneer farms at the mouth of Mill Creek Canyon. Today, if we go to that area, you can still see juniper in the background, you can still see oaks and sagebrush on the hillside, but the area is now heavily urbanized, and what we have created is essentially an urban forest. We'll see the same thing if we go up to Federal Heights. Here's a picture taken in 1913, and here's a picture today taken from Google Maps. Again, the same phenomenon, a conversion from grassland to shrubland to urban forest. So we created this urban forest in an area that didn't have a forest before. So how is it that we go about creating an urban forest in a semi-desert grassland shrubland? Well, we do know that native grasses were gone, and we do know that we see a different picture as we look across the valley today. We created this urban forest through irrigation. We receive about 415 millimeters of precipitation in the Salt Lake Valley, and most of that comes in the winter and spring, not in the summer. But in the summer, we add about 1,270 millimeters of irrigation. So instead of having a vegetation growing on only 415 millimeters, we have the vegetation growing on about 1,700 millimeters of precipitation. That is, we converted from a grassland to a shrubland to an urban forest simply by applying water. Now, today, as you know, this urban forest extends all the way to the foothills. Here, this is a picture taken just off Wasatch Boulevard, and you can see that we still have the native shrubs that were there 100 years ago. We have rabbit brush in the foreground, then we have sagebrush off in the distance. But in the valley, we have an urban forest of deciduous trees and an urban forest of coniferous trees. We began some practices, though, that resulted in significant changes. And the first part I've already described, the grasses have been eaten and largely replaced by shrubs. But the Mormon pioneers grazed as if the vegetation could withstand that pressure. And this created the story I call the ranchers of Utah, the ranchers in the legislature versus Walter Cottom, a pioneering professor at the University of Utah. In fact, one of our most beloved professors. The practice in Utah was to graze cattle in the valley. When that food resource became scarce, the practice became to have the cattle spend the summers in the Park City and Uinta range, and then to come down through the Salt Lake Valley and reside in the winter out near the airport, in the grasslands near the Great Salt Lake. There were sheep doing this, there were cattle doing this, and those drives used to go right through Salt Lake City. In fact, up until the 1950s, they would actually be driven up through the valley, through what is now Sugar House, on up into Parley's Canyon. And here you see a picture of one of these with the sheep eating all the vegetation as they're being driven up in the summer or in the spring and then being driven down in the fall. There were hordes of them, but how many were there? Well, we have some good records. We obviously know that there were no sheep and no cattle in 1840. But by 1870, there were approximately 50,000 sheep and 200,000 cattle grazing across Utah. Not just the Salt Lake Valley, but grazing across Utah. By near the turn of the century, there were many more. And by the turn of the century, 1900, there were 3,700,000 sheep throughout Utah and 350,000 cattle. This grazing had a significant impact on the vegetation in Utah. It caused a massive degradation of the vegetation. It caused massive erosion. And you can see those signs of erosion today when you look at a number of the steep canyons in northern and southern Utah. Well, what changed as well during this time? What we see is that there were big changes in the kinds of plants on the landscape. Some plants, such as juniper and pinyon trees, expanded in abundance. Some shrubs, such as sagebrush and rabbitbrush, expanded in abundance. Others, such as shadscale, increased in abundance. But interestingly, at least one shrub, white sage, otherwise known as Eurotia lanata, decreased in abundance. It decreased in abundance because it is a preferred grazing plant by cattle. And of course, we lost a significant amount of perennial grasses. But there were other aspects changing. So here we're looking at Tooele Valley by 1911. Earlier, I mentioned that it had been a grassland. But when we look at it in 1911, what we see is that it's now a shrubland. The grasses have been eaten and the shrubs have taken over. Not a preferred grazing landscape. But if we look at it as recently as 1980, we see that many of those shrubs are disappearing. And instead, in their place, we now have a grassland. But it's not the nutritious perennial grassland that we had before. It's actually an annual grassland, with the grass being something called cheatgrass, Bromus tictorum. So we've gone from a perennial grassland to a shrubland to a shrubland which is now dominated or has a significant amount of Bromus tictorum cheatgrass. We can look at another picture. Here again, looking at Cedar Mountain from the west. We see in the 1901 era lots of shrubs. And when we look at it in 1976, notice the big change, that there are annual grasses. And then there are patches where there are grasses but no shrubs. That is the result of fire. We didn't have a preponderance of fire when the Mormon pioneers arrived. We did not have a preponderance of fire when the area was shrublands. But when this invasive grass called sheetgrass came into play, came into the area, it filled up the spaces between shrubs so that if there was a dry lightning strike, that dry lightning strike could propagate. And that resulted in the burning of vast areas, which then became grasslands. Today, if we go look at this, thanks to Google Earth, we see that the shrubs are all gone. Repeated fires have driven out the shrubs and made this an annual grassland. Now setting the stage for the next vegetation change, which is going to be urbanization. The ecologist Walter Cottam fought this, And that made him enemy number one with the Utah legislature. In fact, he wrote an article called "Is Utah Sahara Bound?" It angered the legislature. It angered the ranchers to no end because it suggested that land management practices need to change. And if we didn't, we would overgraze the grasslands just like they had been overgrazed in northern Africa, resulting in the creation of the Saharan desert. And he asked, is Utah Sahara bound, and what can we do to change this? Well, this flew in the face of what people were saying at that time. Basically, what Walter Cottom concluded was that the Mormon pioneers didn't understand basic ecological principles. They never took my class at the University of Utah. They didn't appreciate that in this new environment that they had landed in, that the rains were in the winter and the spring, that it was not an area dominated by summer rains, such as you would have had in the Midwest and the East Coast, or where they had come from in Europe. So they didn't understand that the grazing practices had to be different than the grazing practices from where they came. And in fact, the church leader, Parley Pratt, stated that Utah could supply pasture for grazing without any limit and raise cattle and sheep to any amount, because his knowledge was based on the drizzling rains and the cold, humid climate of Britain. He had not yet been tempered by the occasional drenchings and the prolonged drought that characterize a hot, dry desert such as the Utah Valley in the summer. Now, Walter Cottom was not only a famous and beloved ecologist at the University of Utah in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, on into the 60s. I met him when I arrived here in 77, but he also founded something called the Ecologists Union, which today you know as the Nature Conservancy. So it's important that we place into context why people behaved in the way they do. If I had migrated from Switzerland, shown here in this picture, to Utah, I might have expected that the area could support heavy grazing, but it can't because of the dry summers. So this practice, this carryover practice of grazing from where people had come from, resulted in these massive vegetation shifts. And as I showed before, and I'll show you again, there are these massive drives of moving cattle and sheep from the wintering grounds near the Salt Lake Airport up into the mountains. That practice changed probably in the early to mid-1950s when we began to truck them rather than having them migrate through the valley. Now, for those of you that long for this whole practice of migrating through the valley, I encourage you to go up to Ketchum, Idaho, where Sun Valley is, because they still have the sheep drive through the city in the fall. But the sheep denuded Emigration Canyon. And Utah, Salt Lake City had created Mountain Dell Reservoir as a reservoir for water, and they were constantly complaining about the 150,000 sheep each year that would migrate up and contaminate the water. Well, Walter Cottom decided that they needed evidence to support that claim. So he compared the vegetation in Red Butte Canyon and in Emigration Canyon. So Emigration Canyon is where all the sheep were migrating, and Red Butte Canyon, as I'll tell you in a few minutes, is a protected watershed. It had been the Army's secure water storage, and they did not allow any grazing. As I mentioned, Walter Cottom was a beloved faculty. He was just loved by every student. He offered a course that was very popular both among undergraduates and the public, and that was called Spring Flowers of the Wasatch. Well, the university planning decided that we didn't need to have winding canyons, little gullies going through campus. And an attempt was made in the early 1940s to take an area and smooth it out. And the area was the area due west of the old museum, which is now the Crocker Science Center, and near the old elementary school, which is now going to be a new Department of Atmospheric Sciences. Students protested. They protested in numbers. You usually don't think of the University of Utah students as protesting, but they did. And in fact, they did something clever. They approached the president of the university and said, "We'd like to give a gift to the university. And we're going to call that gift Cottom's Gulch." So the class of 1947 gave the university Cottom's Gulch and paved it with these stones. It's still here today. Walter Cottom did something else. He collected plants to show people the diversity of plant life that there is so they could appreciate all the variation. And as you pass through Cottom's Gulch, you'll see that each of the trees is a different kind of tree. Walter Cottom loved collecting seeds from around the world and planting trees across our campus. And today, we have over 13,000 trees on our campus. Walter Cottom was important in trying to get these trees established, and he was quite important in describing where they are. And today, we now have GIS maps that allow us to look at every single tree and know what it is as you walk across campus. In fact, we have apps so that you can do this. He was instrumental in making the University of Utah the state arboretum, because with that, he could show to the legislature that we're doing an important job of cultivating different species to introduce people to the different kinds of plant life that are found on our planet. I would encourage Holladay, Mill Creek, Cottonwood Heights, and the other areas to do the same thing. Try to help people understand the broad diversity of trees that we have in our yards. Now, you can't do this for the backyards, but on city-owned, county-owned materials, and maybe in their front yards, it might be possible to construct such maps. Now, I had already mentioned in a previous slide that there were invasive grasses. Those invasive grasses brought fire, and that is what changed the landscape. The culprit in this story is cheatgrass, Bromus tinctorum, shown here on the left, and in the landscape here with the sagebrush shown on the lower right. Why is it called cheatgrass? It's called cheatgrass because it's an invasive species from Central Asia, and it germinates early, it grows early, and by growing early, it uses up the water before the native vegetation becomes active. So it essentially is cheating the native vegetation out of water. And that's what makes it so competitive. It is not particularly good food for cattle, and so it tends to be largely ignored by animals unless they are absolutely starving. It was introduced in the late 1890s, and the records indicate that all cheatgrass that were found, let's say as early as 1900, were found only next to railroad lines. And so here you see the lines in between state boundaries are the paths of the railroads. And by 1910, it began to spread again along railroad paths, probably introduced on the hooves of cattle or maybe as part of some feed that was brought in. But they originated, the Bromus tinctorum originated from Central Asia. By 1930, it was everywhere. And by the 1950s and certainly into the 60s, it began to form a solid mat between shrubs, and the result was that when there were dry lightning strikes, fires were created. They were created because we now had a vegetation connection between the cheatgrass, one shrub, and the next shrub, so that the fire could be carried. And so here's the story of how the landscape became to change. We had perennial grasses at the time that Mormon pioneers arrived. They grazed, overgrazed, resulting in the expansion of shrubs as the grasses decreased. Then we had the introduction of this invasive species. And so we went from a perennial shrubland to a perennial shrubland with annual grasses, because cheatgrass is an annual grass. But then now we introduce fire. With fire, we have a burning off of everything on the landscape. But depending on the frequency of fire, the invasive annual will come back. But it takes many years for the shrubs to come back, so that you essentially are converting a shrubland into an annual grassland. And as you drive across much of Nevada, Idaho, northern and western Utah, what you see are extensive grasslands, but they're annual grasslands with invasive species. Not only did the early pioneers have a significant impact on the grazing lands, the semi-arid desert regions, but they had a real impact on our forest landscapes in the Wasatch Front. Most of us, when we go up and hike in the Wasatch now, enjoy this beautiful, serenic scene with trees and shrubs and beautiful lakes. But at the time the Mormon pioneers arrived, there was a tremendous interest in taking advantage of that timber. And so if you go into a number of the canyons today, you'll find, let's say, such as in Big Cottonwood Canyon, Mill A, Mill B, Mill C, Mill D, Mill E. So these are names that we're familiar with because those were once the locations of a thriving industry. And here's a picture of one of those mills in Big Cottonwood Canyon. The consequence of all this timber harvesting was that the landscape changed. And so here's a picture in the late 1800s showing that all the big trees had now been timbered. So there were many open areas, the amount of erosion had increased, but it was even worse in Little Cottonwood Canyon because there was very successful mining there, just as there was in Park City. So the trees were cut down because they were used for timber in the mine shafts, they were used for construction, they were used for heating. So here's a picture taken from Alta early on, but later on, when you look at the hillside, you see there are absolutely no trees. Yet if you go there today, you'll see that it's a heavily forested area. So what happened? Well, we have to appreciate that this overharvesting, and this is a picture from Big Cottonwood Canyon, this overharvesting resulted in shrub invasion, increased erosions, and a loss of all the forest, much of the forest. In the early 1900s, about 1904, 1906, the United States created the Forest Service. And the role of the Forest Service was to grow new forests for timber harvest, create an area for recreation, and create an area for opportunity. So they developed reforestation programs. And the citizens of Salt Lake City were constantly complaining about the lack of trees, and so they encouraged Gifford Pinochet, who was the first head of the Forest Service, to come visit the situation in Salt Lake City. Gifford was shocked by what he saw, and he brought in somebody who he thought could solve the issue of revegetation, and that was Albert Potter. And with Potter, what they began to do is to suggest we should have a nursery for restoration. And here in the bottom left, what you see is that nursery when it was set up in the Wasatch Front. And on the lower right, you see them harvesting these young trees to plant out into the landscape. About that time, we began to appreciate Arbor Day. So the citizens of Salt Lake City, including the University of Utah, responded to the challenge by also planting trees on campus. So here's Arbor Day 1901. Look at the background buildings, and you'll see that that vegetation is now trees today. So there's a real effort to plant trees, and as I mentioned, that took place all across the University of Utah campus, and today we have over 13,000 with a high diversity of trees, making the campus one of the greenest parts of the Salt Lake Valley. So where was this nursery? Well, the nursery, it turns out, was in Big Cottonwood Canyon. Here you can see the nursery in 1910, and after it had been underway, and you see the sparseness of trees that are on the hillsides. Today, of course, that hillside is absolutely covered with trees. As a result of this Wasatch Nursery in Big Cottonwood Canyon, which produced tens of millions of trees. So lots of trees, in fact, millions of trees were grown, including Douglas fir, the dominant lumber tree, subalpine fir. They also grew grasses to help reduce erosion rates. So everything was allowed to grow for 2 years, and then they were taken into the hillsides, and there were massive planting efforts in the 1910s to revegetate the landscape of Utah. So here you see planting in this picture and an old tree stump in the back. After a while, their work was complete. So by the mid-1920s, the Wasatch Nursery had completed, and it was then abandoned. Today, you know that area as the Spruces Campground. And the Spruces Campground has some remnant trees that you would not expect to find growing in Big Cottonwood Canyon in the landscape around the Spruces Campground. So they include things such as limber pine. They include things such as lodgepole pine. The closest lodgepole pine naturally is going to be in the Uintas. And it also includes ponderosa pine, and I believe there are a few larch, the deciduous conifer. So we went from a landscape that was barren to the landscape that you appreciate today, which is heavily forested. And for that, we can thank the Forest Service back in the 1910s and 20s for reforesting our area, and for Salt Lake City taking much better and stronger control of the watershed. Some aspects of the mining era still persist today. Here you can see mine tailings, and these mine tailings will persist for hundreds of years because of the toxic metals that have been brought to the surface. So I've told you a couple of stories about changing the landscape because of grazing, changing the landscape because of timber harvest, but we also changed the landscape because of Utah's policies and federal policies regarding forests. And those policies are all driven by one phenomenon, Smokey Bear. So coincident with the overgrazing, federal policies, state policies were prevent fires, prevent all fires. Modern ecological thought, though, informs us that fires are a natural process in many, if not all, ecosystems, but that the fuel buildup, because of our practices, can result in not low-grade fires, but dangerous, destructive fires. Among the things that we saw as a result of these policy changes was that in the hillsides, juniper and pinyon began to expand. So here you see some juniper trees and pinyon trees with an occasional, in this case more than occasional, sagebrush in the foreground. We have some before and after pictures that allow us to see how much things changed with this policy. In 1901, this picture was taken. You see that it's an area dominated by sagebrush with ribbons of juniper up on the hillside. Today, in 1980, we took a picture, same location. The sagebrush are largely gone, but because of fire prevention policies, the juniper dominated. Another picture, 1901. This is in the Stansbury Mountains, and you see a horse in the foreground with sagebrush and an occasional juniper. Today, that horse is still there, but you can't see it because the area is now dominated by juniper. So there's been a juniper expansion, pinyon pine expansion, over the last century because of these policies of do not let it burn. The challenge now is that you can't go back to a let it burn policy without thinning out some of this vegetation, because otherwise you'll have massive fires. So you'll often see efforts made to cut away the vegetation to create strips as if there had been a fire that had gone through, so that when you have a fire, it's not a disastrous fire. And if the frequency of fires is low enough, then shrubs can come back into the landscape. I have to say that the Mormons and the U.S. Army were not the very best of friends. They were not the best of neighbors. And as a result of that, you and I are the beneficiaries. The Mormon population was not very happy when Abraham Lincoln brought in a brigade of soldiers to establish Fort Douglas. The Army tended to be independent, to try to remain largely out of contact with the Mormon pioneers, Mormon communities, but nevertheless they had their job. The challenge was that the Mormon pioneers, Mormon community would come in and poison their wells. This got to be bad enough that the Army went to the legislature, to Congress, and asked if they could have a watershed set aside that they could use, they could protect, and maintain as their watershed. And that watershed was allocated to them by Congress, and that is Red Butte Canyon. So Red Butte Canyon was off limits to development, off limits to grazing, off limits to cattle migrating through, and its sole purpose was to maintain a watershed for the Army's water supply. Today, we're the beneficiary because that canyon has been largely protected from human interference. It is an amazing canyon to be in. The public is not allowed in the canyon. It is a canyon set aside now as a research natural area. It was established as a research natural area in the 1960s. So it's an area set aside for us to study plants and ecosystems in a natural setting. It turns out, though, that as a result of having undeveloped area in City Creek, Red Butte Creek, and Upper Emigration, that it's actually the home of large numbers of wildlife that now migrate north and south as they can. And you now know the overpass, and I-80 is a good conduit for them to pass. But there are large elk populations in these canyons, deer populations. I've come across bear as close as 2 miles to the city, and large numbers of bobcat and lynx and other kinds of birds and animals. But the university and others have not done a good job of protecting the foreground. And so we find that there's a university incinerator there today, parking spaces, Olympic Village, and Red Butte Gardens. So we do have these threats, but the Forest Service is doing the best they can to protect this watershed. And it's an amazing watershed of about 5,000 acres, goes all the way up to the little tiny village of Pinecrest. And so we have this wonderful area between Upper Emigration, Red Butte, and City Creek that is a real treasure that complements the treasure to the south, which are the Cottonwood Canyons. So here's a picture taken from a reservoir which is up there that was supplied the city from one of our weather stations. You can see this as a beautiful area for doing research and for bringing students up to understand more about the diversity of life that we have in our region. That brings me to the last story of what's the future of the vegetation. We've gone from perennial grassland to shrubland to annual grassland to urban forest. So what's in our future? Well, Envision Utah has done a good job, as has the Central Wasatch Commission, in trying to help understand how do we plan for the future. We're not seeing land being created at the moment, but we certainly are seeing people move into the area. So how can plant ecology, planning, and preservation play a role in protecting what we have? We've already changed from shrubland to an urban forest, but what are we going to do with the mountains? Well, the first challenge to recognize is that when I moved to Utah in 1977, there were about 1.7 million people in Utah. Today, 3.5, we're on our way to 6 million people. The age distribution of those people is changing. You see here the males on one side and the females on the other, and each of the little tiles there represents an age category. So we are a population now which is bulging at the low end, which meant that we've had historically a large number of children, and you can see by the wiggles, populations moving in. And you have a projection for what we're going to look like in 2065. We're going to grow, and we're going to age. And the areas of growth are going to be in the valleys, not in mountains, except when you get up to the junction of Park City or into Tooele Valley. Envision Utah is doing a great job of helping the communities understand some of these growth pressures and the cascading influence of how that influences other resources, including recreation. I was part of the Wasatch Commission, a Wasatch Commission project, which evolved out of the Mountain Accord. And the Central Wasatch Commission is trying to understand, help us plan, and help us prepare for a sustainable Wasatch Mountain future. I was part of a group that helped form the climate map, the climate element that we have on the landscape, which describes air quality, geology, vegetation, water, wildlife, and human elements. I encourage you to go to that site. You see the URL here. Explore it. It works on your phone. It describes the vegetation. It gives you GIS maps in great detail. But more important, it helps you as citizens prepare for something. The Wasatch Mountain is a great resource. The Wasatch Mountains are a great resource. They are also a big economic asset to our community. There are just as many people that come up to ski in the winter as there are that use it in the summer. In fact, there may be more people using it in the summer. The west side in Salt Lake County is largely protected because it's owned by Salt Lake City Corporation and the Forest Service. The east side, less protected because much of it is private, stemming from the old mine claiming years. But how are we going to protect it? Well, one of the ways that people have proposed, and the Central Wasatch Commission has led the effort on, was a Central Wasatch Commission, or a National Conservation and Recreation Area. Can we take the entire area and begin to protect it? Thanks to Representative Owens, back in the 60s and 70s, we set aside Mount Olympus, Twin Peaks, and Lone Peak as wilderness areas. The notion that's been presented is to expand this and create a national recreation area so that we don't see further erosion of this natural landscape, but we make it available for skiing, we make it available for hiking, we make it available for camping, even making it available for some expanded ski expansion areas. And there are some areas, such as down near Little Bell and up near Parley's Canyon, that have also been proposed. Because Congress cannot seem to get its act together. Nothing has happened for the last 4 years. I hope something will happen now, and that the citizens of Utah will recognize what a great resource they have, and the only way to protect that resources is in some way to protect it through conservation and recreation area integration. Because Utah is going to grow, as I mentioned, but Utah is not going to grow evenly. These are the absolute population changes between 2015 and 2065. And I want you to see that Millard County is only going to grow by 5,000. But Utah County is going to grow by over 1 million. The Salt Lake Valley is going to grow by 600,000. And Davis County by 200,000. So the growth that's going to take place is going to put even more pressure on our precious and valuable mountains. I hope this has helped you understand something about what has happened to our canyons, what's happened to our valley, and what can happen in the future. And I very much appreciate your attention. Thank you.